Hello everyone and welcome to our live online subject spotlight international relations session on people, power and pandemics, what COVID-19 reveals about international relations in our world today. This is part of the University of Chester's online kitchen sessions programme and my name is Zoe Lee. I am one of the school's college liaison assistants here at the university. And today I am joined by Rachel Massey, a senior lecturer in social and political science faculty, and she will be delivering the session today. Do you want to just say hello for us, Rachel?
Hi everyone. As mentioned, I'm Dr Rachel Massey and I'm a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Chester.
Perfect, thank you very much. You will see her shortly, and I am also joined by Helen, who will be moderating any questions as they come in. Would you like to say hello as well, Helen?
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Perfect, thank you very much. In terms of how today will work, I'll shortly be handing over to Rachel for the presentation. And during that presentation, please do feel free to ask any questions via the chat function on the right-hand side, sorry. Your audio and your video won't be shared, but please do feel free to ask those questions because you can do them anonymously if you'd like to. Just make sure that you click the box to say that you would like to be anonymous. You can also like other people's questions as well. So if there is one question that you seem to really like, please click the little thumbs up button because then the ones that are liked the most, we'll ask them first, just in case loads of questions come through and we don't get a chance to answer them all today for you. So any of these questions that come through, Helen will collate for us and she'll ask them to Rachel at the end of the session. If there's not time to answer all of the questions, the answers will be published on the website at a later date, so don't worry if your question doesn't get asked. So at the very end, you will also have the opportunity to complete a short evaluation form for us as well. So if you could please do that, it would be really helpful. Thank you. And any links that we put in during the presentation will also be available on the recording, just in case you would like to go and have a look at anything else on the website that we talk about. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I think we're ready to go live to you, Rachel, in a moment. Is that all okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm ready whenever you are.
Thank you very much. Enjoy, everyone.
All right. Am I okay to go live now?
Perfect.
Great. So welcome to this kitchen session on people, power and pandemics, what COVID-19 reveals about international relations in our world today. I currently teach across a number of modules on politics and international relations at the University of Chester, and I specialise in the theory and practice of international politics. Now, I want to start today's session by stating that I'm not an expert in global pandemics. The aim of this session is therefore not to give you a comprehensive overview of the COVID-19 outbreak, but rather to introduce you to what an international relations analysis of the pandemic might look like. And in order to do this, I'm going to start by explaining what international relations is, before discussing some recent trends in world politics and what they might tell us about the global response to COVID-19. So, for those of you who may not know very much about international relations, it's the academic discipline that studies the global dimensions of politics. International relations as an academic discipline asks fundamental questions about how global politics are organised, who are the main actors, how do they interact with each other, and is change for the better possible or not? And in asking these questions, it seeks to understand things such as the nature and exercise of power within the global system, the origins of conflict and the maintenance of peace in world politics, and the role of the state and non-state actors in international decision-making. Today, international relations is one of the fastest growing academic disciplines in the world. The study of international relations has grown as the world has become increasingly connected through new modes of global commerce, communication and movement, as well as concerns about pressing global problems that exceed national borders. For instance, human rights, international terrorism, economic crises, natural disasters, and of course, most recently, global pandemics. So since the start of the 21st century, we have witnessed numerous global health crises on a fairly regular basis. For instance, Ebola, avian flu, severe acute respiratory syndrome, and Middle East respiratory syndrome. The COVID-19 pandemic, however, is the first global health crisis that has in some way influenced the normal life of every single person around the world. The COVID-19 crisis has interrupted local, regional and global economies. It's brought to a halt commerce and travel, and it's disrupted many aspects of our everyday lives. As such, the emergence of COVID-19 in 2019 might be one of the most consequential events of the early 21st century. Now, the outbreak of COVID-19 is first and foremost a health crisis, with approximately 47.6 million cases and over 1.2 million deaths recorded globally so far. But it's also an economic crisis. The various restrictions imposed to reduce transmission and save lives has had the unfortunate effect of dramatically diminishing economic activity, resulting in massive unemployment and economic income losses around the world. It's also been a disaster for women globally, who, although significantly less likely to die from the virus than men, are already bearing the brunt of the crisis. As the United Nations has highlighted, we're witnessing an enormous spike in domestic violence against women around the world. Women are also disproportionately losing their jobs, since the majority of them work in insecure, informal and lower paid employment. And finally, women are at high risk of exposure to coronaviruses as frontline health and care workers. As the World Health Organization estimates, globally 90% of all nurses are women. COVID-19 has also exacerbated existing social and economic inequalities within societies. For example, many migrant communities have been particularly hard hit by the virus because they've had to continue working in precarious jobs throughout the pandemic, and because migrants make up a large proportion of frontline staff, for example, in hospitals. This is not only the case in the UK, but also in countries like Qatar and India, where factories and workplaces closed during the lockdown, leaving millions with poor access to basic necessities such as food. As a global issue whose effects transcend national borders, COVID-19 reveals much about international relations in our world today. It highlights the interdependent nature of global politics, how we are all connected to each other through our economic, political and social activities, and how an event which takes place in one part of the world can have a dramatic impact on all of our lives. At the same time, COVID-19 also reveals how these international relations are shaped by vast inequalities in power and wealth, which constrain international actors and organisations' ability to respond to global crises. As I'll go on to show in this talk, inequalities between powerful and weak states, the global north and the global south, the rich and the poor, determine how resources are distributed globally during crises. They also influence who is most exposed to harm and who gets protected. Now, in order to better understand the power dynamics and inequalities that have shaped the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we first need to go back in time and look at the history of international politics before considering some more recent global trends. In this section of the talk, I'm going to trace the development of a liberal international order in the 20th century, and how this has been recently thrown into crises by the rise of populism. I then look at what consequences this has for global cooperation in the face of the pandemic, and offer some other conclusions. So, the discipline of international relations is integrally linked to the rhythms of the global political landscape. Its emergence as an academic discipline in 1919 coincided with the development of a new liberal international order in global politics. After the Second World War, the winners built a Western-led liberal international order organised around economic openness, multilateral institutions, security cooperation, and democratic solidarity. Along the way, the United States became the first citizen of this order, providing it with hegemonic leadership, stabilising the world economy, fostering cooperation, and championing free world values, with Western Europe as a key partner. And with the end of the Cold War, we saw this order spread outwards. Around the world, countries made democratic transitions and became integrated into the world economy. As the post-war order expanded, so too did its governance institutions. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization expanded. The World Trade Organization was launched, and the Group of 20 took centre stage in global politics. Looking at the world at the end of the 20th century, one could be excused for thinking that history was moving in a more liberal internationalist direction. Today, this liberal international order, however, is in crisis. In 2016, the United States elected a president who was actively hostile to liberal internationalism. Simultaneously, Britain's decision to leave the EU appeared to mark an end to the long post-war project of building a greater union. Meanwhile, liberal democracy itself appears to be in retreat as varieties of new authoritarianism rise to salience in countries around the world. One of the major changes to the global political landscape that we've witnessed in recent years has been the rise of populism. Populism is a common buzzword found in media and political discourses. Some academics have argued that the term populism is too vague and too broad, making it unhelpful for analysing politics. What, however, is distinctive about populism is how it presents a picture of society as divided in two, the people versus the elite. Often populist politics involve a charismatic leader who promises to stand up for the ordinary people and take on the establishment on their behalf. And in this way, they hope to disrupt elite control over politics. In recent years, the appeal of populism has grown with mounting public discontent over the status quo. Around the world, many people feel left behind by the forces of globalization and growing levels of inequality. Some are uneasy with societies that have become more ethnically, religiously, and racially diverse. And there's also an increasing sense that political parties and the elite ignore public concerns. Expressions of this form of populism often has a nationalist character. Characteristic of nationalist populism is the stoking of fears about dangerous outsiders, which populist politicians then claim to secure the people against. For instance, through harsh treatment of refugees, immigrant communities, and other minorities. For many global commentators, this trend in particular threatens the future of liberal internationalism in world politics. The rise in populism, they argue, signals a shift in the global system away from liberal ideas and institutions such as free trade, international law, and collective security, towards growing nationalism and protectionism. Therefore, although a lot of academics are highly critical of the US-led liberal international order that has dominated world politics for the last 70 years, many are also very alarmed by what might replace it. For scholars and students of contemporary international relations, these developments raise important questions about whether we're seeing a shift to a new set of priorities and values in world politics. And it's against this backdrop that international relations scholars ask questions about the global response to COVID-19. Politics has been at the core of how governments have responded to COVID-19. Political decisions have determined how effective different governments have been in managing the spread of the virus. As several international relations scholars have importantly highlighted, COVID-19 isn't just a political, but also a global political crisis. As such, it requires that we respond globally to redistribute resources, equipment and knowledge, not only within countries, but also between them. And for them, this necessitates not only short-term solutions, but also long-term ones that prioritise investing in health provision and developing stronger, more accountable forms of global governance and institutions, for example, by properly funding the World Health Organization. Some commentators have also suggested that the COVID-19 crisis is perhaps an opportunity for change. It could be a catalyst for a more progressive vision of how we function as a global society, from a slower pace of life to alternative ways of working, to supporting our public social infrastructure. Yet across the world, the need for swift global action in response to COVID-19 has been used to justify authoritarian and violent responses against populations in need of protection, to close borders and halt asylum claims, and to fight over medical supplies and funding. I want us to look at each of these a little bit more closely. Although there is a growing global consensus that efforts to protect public health in the face of the coronavirus pandemic demand temporary sacrifices of some individual freedoms, human rights experts have urged countries to ensure their responses to the pandemic are proportionate, that they are necessary, and that they are non-discriminatory. In the first wave of the breakout, footage, however, emerged of migrant workers in India being sprayed with chemicals, apparently in an attempt to disinfect them before they entered their home provinces. Reports have also emerged of police firing tear gas at ferry commuters and subjecting people accused of breaking quarantine rules to humiliating punishments in India. In the Philippines and Paraguay, curfew violators were also subject to degrading treatment by police, while in Kenya, a 13-year-old boy was shot as police moved through his neighbourhood, enforcing a coronavirus curfew. As academics from the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Centre for International Development highlight, it is often the least well off who are targeted by such punishments. The effects of the pandemic, they argue, are not evenly distributed, and it is the poorest and most vulnerable who are most affected by lockdown and authoritarian responses. Those who cannot work from home, or do not have secure contracts or protected salaries, rely on being able to travel to find work and to respond to employment opportunities as they arise. In addition to those who need to travel for work, people who migrate in search of protection from war or persecution are particularly vulnerable at this time. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees states that the international community must ensure that the rights of migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, and those on the move are protected during the pandemic. However, across Europe and the globe more generally, countries have closed borders and put strict movement restrictions into place. For those seeking asylum or temporary migratory work, such constraints directly threaten their access to healthcare, to safety, and to livelihood. Some states, like Portugal, have temporarily extended full citizenship rights to asylum seekers in order to ensure healthcare access. Others, however, such as the United States, halted asylum claims altogether, violating international law and putting individuals at risk. In the UK, the Home Office has continued to carry out deportations, despite the United Nations warning that they risk spreading coronavirus further. Meanwhile, in refugee camps across the world, from Rohingya Muslims in Bangladesh to Syrian refugees in Jordan, people have tried to adapt to COVID-19 prevention measures. However, for those living in overcrowded camps with limited access to sanitation, hygiene and social distancing guidelines can be really difficult to abide by. For example, the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya is home to over 190,000 displaced people, yet it has just 25 beds for those who contract coronavirus. In this context, we might hope to see countries working together and utilising international law and institutions to protect people's human rights to healthcare, safety and livelihood, while also tackling the pandemic. Instead, what we've seen is countries competing with each other globally to secure medical supplies and withdrawing funding from the World Health Organization, whose primary role is to direct international health within the United Nations system. Just as COVID-19 has spread across the globe, so too have protectionist measures. Governments in different continents have enacted a number of measures to allegedly safeguard their economies and their health systems from the ravages of the pandemic. This is played out in competition between states over medical supplies, such as masks and ventilators, as well as drugs and testing equipment, and more recently vaccines. As the Global Trade Alert Team found, 75 countries have introduced some export curbs on medical supplies, equipment or medicines this year alone. Furthermore, in July earlier this year, the United States formally notified the World Health Organization of its plan to withdraw from it as its primary financial donor. These responses to the crisis then reveal a lot about the current priorities and values in global politics. In particular, they are indicative of how we're seeing a move away from a liberal international order based on cooperation, multilateralism, and free trade, and how in their place we're witnessing increased competition, nationalism, and protectionism. As a result, existing global inequalities between rich and poor, north and south, powerful and powerless, are being exacerbated. At the same time, particular groups of people are being scapegoated and subject to increasing practices of criminalisation and control. Now, this paints a pretty bleak picture of international relations and the COVID-19 response. However, rather than despairing about the state of the world, international relations scholars believe that it is only by properly diagnosing the issues in the international system that we can start to ask questions about how we might transform world politics for the better. International relations scholars are therefore interested in how we can protect vulnerable populations, how we can make the world a more equal place, how we can create more accountable global institutions, and how we can replace self-interested nationalism with a more cooperative form of internationalism. Apologise for my phone ringing. So today's talk is just one example of how we might begin to make sense of the COVID-19 crisis from an international relations perspective by drawing attention to the international political context that frames global responses to COVID-19. Another perspective or lens might draw attention to different global dimensions or to other areas of concern. I however hope that you've found this talk an interesting insight into the political dynamics that shape global responses to the crisis, and I look forward to answering your questions and hearing your thoughts, especially about what we might do to change this way of doing world politics. As I said, I'm open to any of your questions, but if you're not able to think of anything now and you'd like to follow up with me after this session, either about anything I've mentioned or about the international relations programme more generally, please do just send me an email to r.massey@chester.ac.uk. I'm going to stop there and I look forward to taking some of your questions.
That's great, thank you very much for that. I can pop that email address just in the chat as well, so it's easy, just so everyone can copy and paste it if they need it as well for you there. I'm just going to check with Helen if we do have any questions that have come through that we'd like to ask you.
Yes, we do have some questions, so if you're ready, Rachel.
I am.
Okay, so the first question, what does public social infrastructure include?
Okay, public social infrastructure. Sorry, I'm just making a note of the question, so I'm
that's
to be
fine.
sure that I'm covering all bases. So public social infrastructure, it could include a number of things, and this depends on whether we're focusing on the national, the regional, or the global level. So when we're talking about public social infrastructure at the kind of domestic or national level, we're often talking about things like health services and social services that are there to support people during, during kind of normal times, but also kind of during times of crises. So that's what we're talking about when we're thinking about public social infrastructure. Now, if we want to kind of extrapolate that to the global level, or if we want to think about it at the international level, we might want to think about organisations like the kind of World Health Organization and its kind of position within the United Nations, and how that kind of infrastructure exists to protect people's kind of universal rights to things like safety and healthcare and well-being. So when we think about kind of strengthening public social infrastructure, we might differentiate between how we do that at the national and domestic level and how we do that at the global and international level. So it's important to kind of make those distinctions.
Okay,
I hope that helps clarify.
Yes, no, that's great, thank you. The second question, is the purchasing and sharing of a vaccine an international relations topic?
Yes, it is. So can I just clarify the purchasing and the sharing of the vaccine?
Yep, is the purchasing and sharing of a vaccine an international relations topic?
Yeah, it definitely is a topic that could come under the study of international kind of relations, because international relations are interested, as I said at the beginning, in both kind of state and non-state actors. So when we think about the kind of purchasing and sharing of a vaccine, we might focus on the relationships between states and their trade policies, and how that enables purchasing and sharing of vaccines. Or, we might focus on transnational corporations or international businesses, and the role that they play in the global political economy, and how they enable for the kind of sharing of resources such as vaccines, and also kind of knowledge around vaccines. Are vaccines kind of do they have kind of patents on them? Is there, are we able to kind of freely share knowledge about kind of vaccines and produce them? These are definitely topics that scholars of international relations are interested in, and that bring in kind of questions about power and inequality and wealth as well.
Okay, that's great, thank you. This next question got a few likes. So, does the global order have an impact on the ability of countries like Iran to deal with COVID-19 that face sanctions from the USA?
Okay. Do you mind just repeating that one?
Yeah, sure. So, does the global order have an impact on the ability of countries like Iran to deal with COVID-19 that face sanctions from the USA?
Okay, that's quite a tricky one to answer without knowing a little bit more kind of specifically, a little bit more the kind of specifics about the pandemic in how in Iran, and how kind of sanctions are playing out. Whether those kind of sanctions, you'd have to have an understanding of whether those sanctions were directly affecting the purchasing of much needed kind of medical supplies and equipment, or whether medical supplies and equipment were exempt from sanctions. So that's one thing we might start to look at. But you could argue more generally that the sanctions have economic effects on the kind of population of Iran, on the kind of people, and that might further exacerbate how they experience the pandemic. So you could kind of draw direct links to whether the sanctions directly kind of prevent the kind of purchasing of much needed medical supplies and resources, but you could also ask some more complicated questions about the long-term effects of sanctions on the population of Iran, and how that might exacerbate how they experience the economic fallout from COVID-19 today. So there's a sort of a short and a long answer to that question that requires a little bit more kind of research, and probably actually going and reading about Iran and talking to and listening to people from Iran, I would suggest.
Okay, thank you. Following on with a USA themed question, what might the Biden presidency mean for COVID-19?
Yeah, so this is a really an interesting question, and one that's probably quite in people's minds at the moment. And I'm sure it's spurned lots of kind of thought pieces and media pieces recently. The Biden presidency, he's promised to listen to science and to take a new stance on tackling COVID-19. And some of the kind of concrete proposals that Biden suggested are things like establishing a new COVID-19 task force, trying to double the number of drive-through coronavirus testing sites, addressing some of the kind of shortages in personal protective equipment, and very importantly, cancelling the US's plans to leave the World Health Organization. So when we think about it from the perspective of international relations, Biden's election could have a really important implication for international cooperation during the pandemic. It could lead to the increased sharing of information or resources related to the pandemic. However, and it's hard to say anything too concrete at the moment because it's a very fluid situation. But with a likely Republican majority in the Senate, Biden might be quite restrained in the policies that he can pursue domestically as well as internationally. But as I said, it's early days, so it's difficult to tell, and we'll just have to kind of keep watching and paying attention to how the kind of transition to the Biden presidency unfolds, and how successful he is in enacting some of the kind of proposals he made during his campaign.
Okay, that's great, thank you. I've just got one more question about your talk, and then there's a few questions that have come in about the courses, international relations course. Okay, so the last question about the talk is, how do you think COVID-19 will impact on the rise of populism in international politics?
Yeah, so I talked about the kind of context of populism and what that means for responses to kind of COVID-19. So looking really at the kind of impact of populism on how we've responded globally to COVID-19. But we can turn that around and think about what impact COVID-19 itself will actually have on populism. And I think on the one hand, the pandemic undermines populism by revealing the extent to which some of the most kind of pressing issues that we face today can't be dealt within national borders alone. However, as I said in the kind of talk, many countries, rather than kind of reach out to their international allies and cooperate with each other, have treated the pandemic as a national issue, so seeking to close borders as a way of securing themselves and to establish monopolies over medical supplies. At the same time, there are also some kind of promising signs that despite kind of various lockdown and other pandemic restrictions, that people have come together to offer more cooperative visions of international politics. And I think here particularly notable is the Black Lives Matter movement this summer, which, although starting in the USA, spread kind of globally to the UK, Palestine, Brazil, and other parts of the world. And it's, you know, it's perhaps these kind of forms, these grassroots forms of international politics that will have the greatest impact on populism, rather than, say, the individual kind of policies of governments, or even the election of Biden in the US. So yeah, I remain kind of, you know, I think populism is, you know, still very much remains a potent kind of force in international politics today, but there are kind of some signs of it being kind of resisted and challenged that we should pay careful attention to as scholars of international relations.
Okay, that's great, thank you. So that's all the questions about the talk. As I say, there's just a few questions about the course. First one says, does the University of Chester offer a single honours degree in international relations? Now, I think I can answer that by saying yes, we do. It's also offered as a combined degree with international development studies and also with politics. Would I be right? Yep. And then a follow-up question from that really is, do you study the whole world in international relations if you study it?
Yes. So thanks for answering that first question. We do offer the single honours in international relations. We're one of a few universities in the UK that does that, as well as offering the politics and international relations combined programme. We travel all around the world in our various modules, and that, you know, that partly reflects the kind of different research expertise of the lecturers and their interests in different parts of the world. So yeah, there's a huge kind of variety of modules that we offer, but just by kind of way of example, like in the first year, you take a module with my colleague Michael Francis on the kind of globalization of world politics, called Globalization Then and Now, and that really takes you all the way around the kind of world in order to understand the varied and complex kind of economic, political and social links between different countries, and teaches that, you know, going back into kind of history and bringing up right into the kind of present of the 21st century. There are specific kind of modules that look at certain parts of the world. So, for instance, Dr. Suzanne Francis, another colleague of mine, specialises in African politics, and so she teaches a module on Africa and the world. But yeah, more generally, we really do kind of draw from all sorts of regions of the world. In my own kind of teaching on critical security, war and militarism, we look at the US kind of invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, but we also look at the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We look at the use of private military security contractors in Nepal. We look at militarism in the UK. There's so many examples, but yeah, you get a really good sense of the diversity of international politics, as well as the kind of connections between different parts of the world.
So I think you've partly answered the next question, which is, would you be able to explain the key differences between politics and international relations? So I think you've described international relations really well. Are you able to provide any key differences between the politics course and international relations?
I mean, I think it's useful to have a distinction, and you know, these distinctions, in many ways, you know, the study of kind of politics today has to take account of the kind of global, because we all live in an increasingly globalized world. So there is a sense that when you study politics with us, you will also be engaging to some extent with global politics, but you are much more focused on political theory, on questions of the state, on British politics in the politics degree than you are in international politics, where you explore a lot more the global dynamics of politics. So there is a distinction there, although in asking kind of questions about British politics, the state, policy making, you'll end up also engaging with how that occurs in an international context. I hope that helps clarify.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. And as I mentioned, it is possible to do a combined degree in international relations and politics anyway, so if you did have an interest in both, that is something you could look into.
Yeah, your modules would be split between the two programs, so you'd do half your modules in politics and half in international relations.
Yeah, that's great. Now, I did think we'd finished with the talk questions, but one more has just come in, so if you're happy to answer one more. Yeah. How far do you think America remains the most influential nation globally?
So that's a really good question, because obviously there are lots of debates about the decline of US power in world politics. And these debates have actually been going on for quite a while, and they're at the heart of a lot of international relations scholarship. Some people, you know, at various points of history have kind of pointed to the emergence of new powers. At one point, people were pointing to kind of emergence of Brazil. Today, people talk a lot about kind of China and Russia and how that might disrupt the kind of US monopoly over power. You know, so there are kind of various predictions that are made. I don't think it's, you know, I don't think it's something that can be easily answered. Clearly, the United States still wields enormous kind of political, economic, cultural, and military power over the world, but it definitely has been challenged in recent kind of years by other kind of major kind of growing powers in world politics, and also other kind of more grassroots politics as well. So I think rather than kind of give a simple answer there, I'd say that this is something that, you know, you could, it's a topic that you could really kind of delve into if you took an international relations degree, right? It's a topic that you could write an entire essay on and do kind of research around, thinking about, you know, what are the kind of forces that are challenging kind of US power, but also how does the US still exercise its might as the kind of leader or hegemon of the global political order.
Okay, that's great. I think this may be the final question, unless we get any more through. Do you study the United Nations in international relations?
Do we teach about the United Nations?
Yes.
Yes, we do. Obviously, the United Nations is a really important organisation. We teach also about other international organisations and bodies like the World Trade Organization, like the World Health Organization, as well as regional organisations like NATO and kind of ASEAN. But the UN obviously is a really important institution that we pay a lot of attention to. And particularly relevant here is we have a module on peace building and diplomacy taught by Dr. Suzanne Francis that kind of really delves in to the kind of United Nations role in securing, creating, kind of building peace in the world, and there's also, you know, offers some critiques of it as well. So there's and in the past, I know that Dr. Suzanne Francis, who has quite strong kind of links and connections with the United Nations as an independent academic researcher, she has brought members of the United Nations, people involved in United Nations peacekeeping missions around the world into her kind of classroom, either physically or via kind of Skype to talk about the work that they do. So there's a really strong connection there with the United Nations.
Okay, thank you very much. There's no further questions, but there's a couple of comments. One to say thank you, Rachel, and another positive comment saying an interesting session, thank you, and that got 3 likes. So that's all from me, no further questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and thank you for all of your great questions as well. I have just popped in the evaluation form again at the bottom because so many questions came through that I didn't want you to lose it. We hope that you've really enjoyed today's session, and if you could provide us with some feedback, it would be really helpful. There's not many questions on the form, just like 4. It'll take you a few seconds, it won't take long at all. But we look forward to your attendance at our next events, and if you would like to have a look at any other further events, please do take a look at our website. You can also go to the link to our outreach page where you'll find more of our resources and things like that that you might find helpful. So thank you from our team today, and thank you very much to Dr. Rachel Massey as well for a great talk today. Again, we hope you've really enjoyed it, and we will see you at our next event. Bye.